Hi, everyone. I have the pleasure to be here today with Professor Sergey. He did an amazing paper with PICs and instant payment systems here in the US. And we'll talk a little bit about this comparison and the lessons learned from Brazil that can be implemented here in the US. Sergey, thank you so much for being here with us, for your time, and for the amazing paper you did.
Thank you
Can
for inviting
you
me.
Perfect. Can you introduce yourself, tell a little bit about your background, and how do you come to find about Brazilian's Pix instant payment system?
Yeah. Well, my name is Sergey Sarkisyan, and I recently joined Ohio State University's Fisher College of Business as a professor of finance. Before that, I was doing my doctoral studies in Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. I mostly work on banking and payment systems, some interaction with monetary policy in my research. I use both empirical and theoretical tools. And how I came with the idea of studying PICs is because I was interested in how digital currency or payment systems would impact banking generally, or in my case, banking competition. And then I learned that Brazil had a very successful experiment of implementing instant payment system, and that data was actually available even to people who are not affiliated with a central bank or any government structure in Brazil. So that's how I started investigating, how I learned about PICs. I spent a lot of time reading about PICs, and then eventually I downloaded data and I started exploring
Nice.
what happened to banking system in Brazil after introduction of PICs, and the results were quite strong. So I continued with writing the paper, and eventually it ended up as a complete working paper.
Nice, nice, good. So Pix changed not only the financial institutions in Brazil, but was a technology that changed the entire business transaction ecosystem. Every vendor, supplier, and provider adopted Pix as a form of payment. For example, including in the bill not only the credit card payment option and the bank slip that you mentioned in the paper, but also a Pix QR code that makes it easier for people to pay. And also the vendors and the suppliers, they receive the money instantly instead of having to wait for 2 business days, for example, with bank slip. How do you think that will change the US ecosystem for vendors and suppliers?
So the US tried to implement something, well, I wouldn't say exactly similar, but something in line with that, which is FedNow. But FedNow or any other fast payment system that the US has do not allow for retail payments. For example, Venmo or Zelle usually are not accepted as means of payment in the stores, in restaurants, or if you buy online, if you buy a plane ticket or something like that.
Mhm.
I don't see how that will change in the future. Unfortunately, I don't see any positive sign of that being changed in the future. So it seems to me that credit cards will still dominate payment infrastructure in the US.
And do you think that this is mainly due because of lobby of credit card companies, or because if you look into the business side, you have a lot of fees and a lot of transactions, uh, processes that had to come with credit card security wise and all of that. And when we talk about an instant payment like FedNow or Pix, it's less cost for the companies to have that option. So do you think why do you think that that's happening in the US?
I'm not sure if that could be called lobbying, but I think generally there are a lot of profits being made in the system. So every time we tap a credit card and we make a payment, there is a fee that is collected by a merchant, and it's usually sent to partly to the bank and partly to one of the payment providers like Visa or Mastercard or Amex. So the profits are big. They're making huge profits, both banks and payment companies. And of course, these payment companies are the US based. So that's why it's very hard to get their agreement on this. And if we speak about banks, banks joining FedNow would be a necessary condition for FedNow to be used a lot. And if banks are not joining FedNow just because they have their own payment systems or because they don't want to lose their profits from the credit card fees,
Mhm.
that makes it complicated. And speaking about that, there is a very nice work by Tobias Berg and co-authors. They study actually that in Europe, implementing payment systems would actually be more possible, and it would negatively impact companies like Visa and Mastercard. But Europe doesn't care as much about that because Visa and MasterCard are not based in Europe. And I think with Brazil, it was similar thinking, that at least those players are not in the game.
Yeah, of course, definitely. So FedNow was recently introduced. I read last year that it was like delayed and delayed again because there wasn't much banks or credit unions accepting or integrating with the FedNow system. So it's not mandatory. The adoption among banks have been relatively low, mostly on the largest banks. Why do you think that is? That's it is like this, and do you think it's gonna become mandatory sometime in the near future or not?
Yeah, so it's hard to tell if it will become mandatory. So first of all, I think that's an important consideration. I think one of the success reasons or peaks was that it was mandatory. So even though large banks probably didn't like it, they had to join. There was no choice. In the US, the choice is given, and currently FedNow has a lot of participants. I think around 900, but most of them are small banks or credit unions. So very few of large banks, and even if you have large banks, those will be some of the offices, not the headquarters. I definitely think this is very important. Now, if I think the US can technically make FedNow mandatory, so we asked this question to Loretta Mester. Back then, she was a head of Cleveland Fed, and it was a research conference, so it was recorded on YouTube. And her response was that that the Fed is not payment regulator, so at least the Fed cannot mandate this. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not expert in law. I'm not entirely sure if there are no other agencies that could, like OCC, that could mandate banks to join the system. Maybe they could, but I would need to study more to understand this.
Yeah, interesting. Very different than Brazil, where we have the central bank that is the mandatory of all the
Yes.
banking systems and financial institutions.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Uh, you mentioned Pix. Pix is a highly successful government payment, instant payment solution in Brazil. How does it compare with FedNow in how it is right now?
So I think that the biggest difference is that FedNow is not a retail payment system. So it's mostly for transactions between banks. That's one difference. Well, of course, it makes Pix very nice for people who are paying in person or buying something online. And second thing, I think is how user friendly it is. So to use Pix, you can have a bank app or a Pix app or whatever, and then just pay for it. For FedNow, at least how it works is a bit more different. You have to request that the bank uses FedNow to make a transfer. So it's not as I would say it's not as convenient as Pix yet. I don't see any reasons why FedNow cannot at least be something more close to Zelle or Venmo, where at least you can regulate everything from your mobile phone to make it very easy.
Yeah, and I'm not sure the main reason in Brazil why they came up with Pix. If it was to know more about the transactions, because as you mentioned, the paper Pix got a lot of the cash transactions, not as much as credit and debit transactions. So all those cash that was running from hand to hand in Brazil, they became more informatized, and we have more information on this. And then of course the government has more information on this and can like have this own share of the taxes. Do you think that is the reason behind FedNow as well, or not because it's more integrated with Fed and IRS, or is not similar?
I think reasons were some of the reasons were quite similar. We've seen what Governor Campos Neto was saying before introduction of Pix, that it's we have problem with people using cash, we have problem with financial inclusion, and then we have problem with competition. So Pix is supposed to address these issues. With FedNow, issues were similar. I mean, cash is not mentioned as much, and one of the reasons is that FedNow is not supposed to crowd out cash. I mean, if it's supposed to crowd out something, it should be wire transfers or other things people use to make transfers. Regarding the other reasons like financial inclusion or competition, generally they were mentioned, and there were also mentioned reasons like speed of payments. Wire transfers are slow and they're sometimes very expensive. ACH transfers as well. So there was a need for something that would be very fast and very efficient. So that was the goal. Now I'm not sure about the costs. I think FedNow was quite expensive. I'm not sure there's any public data on how much it costed, but I saw numbers close to $1 billion US spent on FedNow. So quite expensive, especially
Yeah.
relative to only $4 million spent on Pix, and that would include not just launching the system but also running it. So Pix was much cheaper, and that also I think is a very important consideration for FedNow and the ways to go about it.
Yeah. Regarding the cost, most part of it, of course, is technology, right? Most banks in Brazil, they have legacy systems that had to be upgraded or interfaced with to achieve Pix desired transaction time of 6 seconds. From the start time to from from my point of view, when we start the transaction, when I send you money, and the time to this money to arrive in your bank account, it has to be six seconds or less. Do you think that this might be a challenge faced by banks and credit unions here in the US in regards to technology and legacy systems?
It's really hard to tell. I'm not an expert in technology, but I don't see reasons why large banks wouldn't have this. I mean, thousands of banks in the US are already using Zelle, and Zelle, it doesn't clear within seconds, but at least you get the money on your bank account within seconds. So it means they have some sort of technology to do this. So it might be that smaller banks would need to implement this, but I don't think that would be undoable.
Yeah. So in regards to Pix roadmap in Brazil, I'm not sure if aware, but Pix has or the central bank has a large roadmap for Pix. Payment installments, payment with no cash where I use my credit to pay you and get a cash advance, something like that. Do you know if we have like this kind of roadmap or this kind of features coming up to FedNow as well? Because those features can also be like that missing feature to have more people asking for FedNow with their credit unions and banks.
Yeah, I mean they do have they do have some plans I think posted on their website, but I think the main thing that they mention and what everyone hopes to have, it's they first have to achieve some usage. People don't really use FedNow as much, although I mean they officially have 900 banks. Most of them are small, so it's nowhere close to levels that Pix or UPI in India had in terms of adoption, right? So I think that will be number one in the roadmap. I know Pix has a big roadmap. I recently listened to an interview in Marcos Academy by Campos Neto, and he mentioned some of those. And I mean, things like international transfers, credit cards integrated with Pix, or crypto integrated with Pix, those are great things. But I think you first have to have a good user base to think about some miscellaneous developments.
Yeah, of course, of course. Yeah, in your studies, you mentioned that small banks have become more competitive because of Pix. Can you elaborate more on that?
Yes, of course. So if we think about the world before Pix was introduced, we have large banks. Well, in Brazilian setting, think of 5 largest banks, for example, or if you like, think of government-owned banks who everyone has accounts in. And then you have smaller banks. So large banks would provide a lot of benefits, like you would have salary accounts, branches everywhere, free accounts, free transfers, many things. For example, I looked at the Banco do Brasil or Caixa. They have more depositors than many US banks would have. So that's really a lot of power. Now, small banks have to compensate by paying high deposit rate because otherwise people would just stay with the large bank. Now, when Pix was introduced, many banks, including small banks, joined the system. So now, if I want to make transfers or fast payments, I don't have to be at a large bank. I can just go to the small bank and also earn high deposit rate. So that was the reason why I see that many people moved from large banks to small banks, maybe by opening second accounts. And that's the reason why I think small banks became larger. And there are many anecdotes. For example, one of the most successful fintech these days, Nubank, it grew a lot since Pix, and I think now it will be classified as a large bank. I haven't checked lastly if they passed Santander in assets, but I think very well soon we might talk about top 6, not top 5.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly.
Okay. Do you think this could be a tool also for small banks in the US through FedNow, although it doesn't have like you cannot purchase something in a store, but do you think it could be useful for small banks in the same way?
hypothetically, it might be, but again, you first need people to use the system. And I think it doesn't help that large banks didn't join. So you need people to have optionality, that you need to send money from your large bank account to a small bank account, but for that you need both large and small bank to be in the same network. And currently, again, when I look the number of the participants in FedNow, those are very small banks or banks that originally participated in tasks of FedNow. So those are not the banks that many people have deposits in. You would still need some initial user base, and that's why I think that was one of the reasons why Brazilian central bank required, I think, 35 largest banks to join the system, and 35 means it includes some of the small banks as well. So it wasn't just Banco do Brasil and Itaú have to join. No, it was a big range of banks that had to join the system.
Yeah, and a lot of fintechs and small institutions also opted in to be in the first batch of PIX implementation. And when we are talking about 900 small banks here in the US, I read that although it's 900, it looks like a large number. Most part of it is only as receivable. They can't initiate a FedNow transaction. They can only receive FedNow transactions. So there is even that, So I'm not sure if I read about that, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I was wondering why the number of banks increased that much. It actually makes sense if they register as receiver, but then they don't actually initiate. So it's possible that their FedNow accounts would have $0 passed. So yeah, I will investigate that. I think that's a good point.
You mentioned that PIX changed the impact, or in other words, the response from banks after monetary change. How did that change?
So generally, when Brazilian central bank, or generally any central bank, increases interest rates by, say, 1 percentage point, well, banks do not increase their deposit rates by that much. Banks have a lot of market power. They can keep very low deposit rates, and people will still stay there for services. For example, in the US, deposit rates would go up only by 40 basis points. We find that in Brazil, it's even less. So banks have even more market power. So banks like Banco do Brasil, I don't think they ever increase deposit rates by more than a couple of basis points. But now when PIX is introduced, people can easily move to bank accounts that have higher deposit rates. So now banks actually have to offer higher deposit rates to keep their depositors, because I know the depositors have easier time to move. You no longer have to go to the branch, no longer have to go to ATM, no longer have to bear consequences of being at the small bank that doesn't offer you as much convenience. You can just easily tap your phone and move to another bank. And that's why banks are starting to offer higher deposit rates. We find in the paper that average deposit rates went up approximately by 0.8 percentage points, which in Brazil is high interest rate environment, so that's not huge, but that's quite big change in deposit rates. And ultimately, what central bank wants, it wants banks to increase deposit rates after policy rate changes, and then we will see effects on bank deposits, on bank lending, and ultimately on investment. So if banks respond more, you will see more changes to monetary policy efficiency. That's exactly what we find in the work.
Yeah, very interesting. And comparing that to the US, how would you characterize the current US payment system? Do you anticipate a shift towards digital wallets and instant payment solutions? Where does the market stand right now, and where do you see it heading in the near future?
Well, I think US has a lot of private solutions. I mentioned Zelle or Venmo. They're quite good. And I believe that large banks or fintechs can provide good solutions of making fast payments. However, at least now, I don't see reasons to see how credit cards could be crowded out, how fees can be reduced by having more competition. So I don't think that will happen soon. I think that things like PIX or if FedNow ever becomes retail can help with that, because you would have something that directly competes with credit cards or debit cards. But again, I hope it will happen. Regulators are sure that they're working on it. I haven't seen anything that suggests that it will happen in the nearest future.
Good. So we are witnessing a lot of mergers in the banking industry right now. How do you think small and medium-sized banks can stay competitive in this environment?
I think as anywhere, they would need to offer some special product or offer very high rates. Now, offering very high deposit rate is costly because you have to pay those, so you cannot stay very competitive. In Brazil, the solution was different. They just got the payment system, so they basically got the technology they were able to use. I do think that we will still continue seeing a lot of consolidation in banking. We will see that every year we have less and less banks. When I started the paper, there were 5,000 banks in the US. By the time I finished my draft of the paper, there were already 4,200. So number of banks is declining, and I do think that large banks will remain more and more powerful. Unless we have some technological boost. Now that being said, I see a big rise in fintechs, especially in countries like Brazil and India, but also in the US. So maybe fintech lenders, if they go under regulation, we already see that they have a big share of mortgage originations. So maybe they will also be able to compete in the payment markets in the future.
Good. Right now, summing banks and credit unions, it's almost 10,000 financial institutions in the US.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the low usage is one of the main problems of FedNow. Like we don't have a lot of banks and we don't have a lot of people using. It's like the problem of the egg and the chicken, right? Who comes first? We need to have a lot of people using, so more people will be using FedNow.
Yes, I think so.
Which approaches do you think make sense for small banks that are more interested in FedNow? They can have or they can make to have more people using FedNow.
Well, I think if small banks, depending on the cost of FedNow, if the cost of joining FedNow are not high, small banks probably should join it. Just hoping that in the future more banks will be in, and they should probably advertise that they're able to use FedNow to make transfers. Now that will be tricky because you have large banks who didn't join. Most people are banked there, and those banks have their own fast payment. Like if you transfer money among large banks, that most likely will be free. You can always use Zelle, that will also be free. So they will always offer better alternatives. But again, if it's not very expensive to join FedNow, I think they should just do that.
Good. Yeah. So right now, you mentioned that large banks will probably move towards FedNow in a time, right? Right now, from a research, Chase and Wells Fargo are one of the largest banks that already have FedNow. Leaving behind probably Bank of America and some other major banks. I think it's not that long time for these large banks to also become part of FedNow. If we keep seeing like this incentives with FedNow adoption across the industry, right?
Yeah, so I'm a bit skeptical about that. I saw that Chase and Wells Fargo joined, and I'm still trying to understand if those are just specific offices. Because, for example, for Chase, the office is mentioned Columbus, Ohio, actually where I'm located right now, but their headquarters are in New York. So I'm not. I right after we do the interview, I might just give them a call and ask if they would accept FedNow. If I'm banked with Chase, maybe they would accept FedNow for transfer, and then we can see that. But I hope that will be true. I hope more banks will join. But joining doesn't mean they will use it a lot.
Yep.
After all, it's their discretion. I might call them and ask to use FedNow, and they might say, we cannot do it now. We have to use FedWire or something else. So it's not like with Pix where I have that power to just open Pix app or my bank app and then scan a QR code and send money. I don't think that's happening anytime very soon.
Good. Curious thing, I was at a Bank of America branch the other day, and I asked my bank manager, how about FedNow, and if he saw FedNow coming to Bank of America. He was not even aware of FedNow. No, because there's a lot of products and a lot of services inside of Bank of America that, as this is not inside Bank of America yet, for him it doesn't matter.
Exactly.
So we still have all this culture change throughout the industry to have more people using FedNow here in the US.
That speaks to a problem, yes.
Yeah. Sergey, any final remarks for this interview?
No, I just want to thank you for the opportunity, and I think I also learned a lot from you and about FedNow. I think that's very useful, and I hope there will be more research studying this, because ultimately I think we would benefit from having fast payment systems without credit card, debit card fees that are imposed in price. So I hope there will be more development in that thing in the US. So I hope to see that in the future.
Perfect. Daniela, do you have any last questions?
That's it. I think it is a great coverage of a great comparison. And I think that now, if really evolves the same way Pix did, it can be much more influential here in the market.
Good.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. I have one last question, one final question. Do you think that Zelle, as it's already inside some of the largest banks, could take the place from FedNow?
Possibly. Necessary condition for that would be that Zelle is accepted as means of payment. Yeah, it's not as, if I'm correct, you cannot open corporate accounts at Zelle. So if a restaurant or American Airlines would want to accept Zelle, they would need to open a corporate account. Now, my speculation, and this is just speculation, I've done any research on this, why you cannot do that, because banks would hurt their own credit card model. If you accept Zelle that doesn't have those fees to be accepted as means of payment, it means you have to agree that you will not get as much fees from credit cards. Unless, of course, they implement Zelle through credit cards, like Nubank is doing with Pix currently. So maybe it will happen. I think Zelle is a very good and very well working app. So I would be happy about that, even if it's a private solution. And it has many banks. It's not only the largest. I think 30% of US FDIC insured US banks are part of Zelle. So it's a big network.
Yeah, it is. It is. Professor Sergey, thank you so much for your time for this interview. It was great to get to meet you and to do this interview with you.
Likewise. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.